I cannot believe this is actually the last one. Went very fast. I am excited about our agenda today. First, Judy emailed out minutes. Hopefully everybody got those and reviewed those, and I would entertain a motion.
So moved.
Okay, Representative Johnson moves and Representative Riley seconds. All in favor of accepting the minutes, say aye. Aye. All opposed? Okay, motion passed, minutes are accepted. Just a couple of things I want to put on your mind before we hear testimony. At the end of committee today, I want to open it up for discussion on future topics, maybe ideas that you may have come to your mind during the session, things that we can look at for next session. So if you'll be thinking about that, and I'll entertain those suggestions at the end of committee today. So on our agenda, we have Ed Klump, and he's going to be talking to us about police protective custody in Kansas. Ed, if you'll come on up. Welcome back to committee. I promised you this hearing, so I did not want to end without that. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate that. Pleasure to be here speaking to you today on this. I know it's been a big topic for you this year with 2132, I think it is. And so it'd be nice to go into a little more depth, I think, on it and talk about it a little bit. So there's actually two things that I want to talk to you about, and one is the police protective custody, and the other is a survey that our associations did before the session started. And I want to go over that with you. So starting with police protective custody. This thing doesn't sound like it's working right. So, as I said, it became a key topic in House Bill 2132 discussions. It appears that it became an issue primarily because of data that showed there was a high number of police protective custodies in Kansas compared to other states. And I don't question that data at all. However, I do kind of question how we got to the conclusion we did from that. So I'll talk about that a little bit. So the primary statute involving police protective custody is 38-2231. And interestingly, you will not find the term police protective custody in the statute books anywhere. There is protective custody in several places, but police protective custody is not mentioned. It's kind of a form of art that developed, I think, out of case law. So there's several areas where we do police protective custody, the juvenile area being just one of them. When we take a person into custody for mental health treatment in a mental health crisis, that's also a police protective custody. That can also apply to a person that is a danger to themselves due to intoxication of drugs or alcohol. So there's several different ways that we take people into our custody absent an arrest or a court order, and that's really what police protective custody is. We take a person into custody for their own protection generally, without a court order and without a criminal charge to charge them with. So we don't take the use of that lightly. Obviously, you're taking somebody's freedom away, hopefully for a good purpose and a good outcome. But we do not take that lightly because it is something that officers are given the authority to do for a very specific and narrow reason. And we want to stay in those guidelines as much as we can. So I talked about the data a little bit, and what we have not seen, and it may exist, but what I haven't seen is any data that reflects why numbers are high in Kansas. Nor have I seen any data that would reflect that out of those that are taken into police protective custody, that any of those have been ruled they should not have been. Now, with that said, we do understand there's a big gap between those taken into custody and those that go through the court system. And there's reasons for that. And so I'll talk about that a little bit also. But that doesn't necessarily convert into an inappropriate taking of a person into police custody. So I've listed 5 things in the testimony there. Just go through those. Number one, we often take police protective custody action outside of normal business hours. And it's when other services aren't readily available. So your mental health centers often aren't open after hours. DCF's not available often after hours. And so we come across these situations and we have to deal with them. And that's where a lot of ours taken care of. And I haven't seen any data. It probably does exist on the timelines of when these are occurring either. I'll explain to you some places where we believe there's probably some occurring in the daytime that don't need to. So when we have, so when we take police protective custody action, we're doing it because we have a reason to believe that immediate action needs to be taken to protect, in this case, a child from harm. And so that's what triggers it. Keep in mind that police protective custody does not necessarily mean that child is not going to go home. It doesn't necessarily mean that child is going to go into foster care. Police protective custody happens the moment we take that child into custody. So let's say we run across an incident where a child is either, let's just talk about neglects, and that's primarily what 2132 is about. A child is in a situation where they're subjected to neglect. The parent is not there. The child may not even be at home, but we take that child into police protective custody. Now, under another statute, we're required to take that child to the parent whenever it's possible. Sometimes that's not possible, but even if we do, from that period of time when we take that child into custody till we release them in their parents, that's police protective custody also. Probably not in the data that DCF has because it doesn't reach that point. Maybe, but it might because we have to report that to DCF. So I don't know how that gets cataloged when we have a quick turnaround like that. Oftentimes, we don't have the resources and services available to address those issues quickly. Oftentimes, these occur really late at night, middle of the night, and we don't have resources we can call in to try to negate the neglect conditions. Where in the daytime, oftentimes we can get a family member to come over and help. Any number of things that we can do to avoid taking the child into custody. So number 2 has to do with the hours of DCF. DCF works 8 to 5 Monday through Friday. That's 45 hours out of the week. That means that 74% of the week, DCF's not available for these. And one of the things about being a police officer, when there is a question needing government services after hours, the number seems to be 911. And we get it. And not just in these cases, not just in child neglect and child abuse and all those, but in any number of areas, mental health situations. A foster parent decides they can't control their kid at 1 o'clock in the morning. Guess who gets the call? We get that call. And then we have to take that child into our custody and try to get them back to the contractor, DCF, whoever has control of that child. So just thinking of that, there's almost 3/4 of the time that it's us that's dealing with this situation. Now, that's not 3/4 of the calls or the incidents, but 3/4 of the time during the week, it's us that's going to be responding to that. We also encounter these oftentimes in our regular police duties. Go into a domestic situation, and even if it's not a violent situation, just an argument that we get called to. Oftentimes we'll run into conditions that we need to act on, and that goes for abuse and neglect. Sometimes we'll go to a domestic and we'll discover that, the husband and the wife are mad at each other, so one of them has been abusing a child and the other one says, well, let me tell you about this. And so they tell us about that, an accusation of abuse, and so then we have to deal with it. Domestic situations involving divorce parties. We run into that a lot, where one side will accuse the other of things, trying to leverage a child custody case or trying to leverage, the settlement in the divorce or something like that. Or sometimes they're just mad at the other party and just want to cause them, grief. But sometimes they're right, and we're left to sort that out. And so those are kind of a lot of the situations we run into. I've been on barking dog calls where I've gone into a house and looked at the house and thought, oh my goodness. And so, it can be any number of things that we do just on our daily activities. So anytime we discover the presence of what appears to be neglect or abuse, then we're going to act on that. We're going to investigate that further and see what's going on and see if anybody really is in danger from it. Even during normal business hours, it's left to law enforcement to take action when we come across something like that and that hadn't been assigned to us through DCF or anything. DCF's unaware of it. Maybe they are aware of it, but we're not aware that they are. And so we run across those, and so again, then we're going to take immediate action. In the words of the statute, if we reasonably believe the child will be harmed if not immediately removed from the place or residence where the child is found. And I emphasize that place or residence because it doesn't always happen in the home. We've had it happen in a child care center. We've had it happen at a friend's house. We've had it happen at a relative's house, but it's not their house. And those sometimes are easy to resolve because we can get hold of the parent and get the child back to the parent. And yes, we've had that child in police protective custody, but only temporarily until we were able to get them to the parent. So number 4 on the list is, again, talking about the short duration and when the parents aren't immediately available. And there's a statute 382232 which guides us in what we need to do with a child once we take them into police protective custody. And the number 1 thing is return to the parent. Only if we can't return to the parent, either because we can't find the parent or because that's the source of the danger, then do we take that child into police protective custody. Number 5, I want to talk about real briefly. And I bring this up kind of tongue-in-cheek because I don't have any data on it, but it's something that comes up every time we have discussions with law enforcement on police protective custody. And that is, investigators and officers tell us about getting a case from DCF, a lot of times on Friday afternoon, that they've been investigating for several days or all week, and they want us to go take that child into protective custody. And oftentimes we will. But they have the opportunity to go to get an ex parte order. And actually, that's what ought to happen. They did the investigation, and they ought to do it. Now, sometimes they will call us because there's a danger involved to the worker in addressing that, and that makes sense. Sometimes we're referred those cases because there's an adjoining criminal allegation that we need to be involved in. We don't mind those. But if that is going on, and it certainly sounds like it from the number of times that people across the state bring this up to us, one of the things that could happen is let's stop that practice. Let's stop the practice of shifting a sync case over to police protective custody that DCF is investigating, and they have the opportunity to go to get an ex parte order. I think there may be a belief that they can only do that 8 to 5 Monday through Friday, but we go get police court orders 24/7 on a regular basis. There is always a judge on call to handle those after-hour emergencies like that. So that's one thing that I wish we would have more discussion on. And and try to dig into that a little deeper, see how big that problem is. If it is a problem, I just want to emphasize, I do not have data on it, but it's worth mentioning because of the frequency we're told about it. We would welcome solutions that would engage DCF more when cases arise outside the normal business hours. We've talked about that before. You all have picked up on that and talked about it. The elimination of neglect cases being referred to us from DCF when there's no criminal element to the complaint or no safety concern where they feel like they need us there. So that's kind of my comments in a nutshell on police protective custody. I did attach the 2 primary statutes to my testimony just for your convenience so you can see what those statutes say. And you want to stop here and answer questions on this and then move into the survey?
Yes, we have a question. Representative Riley?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thanks, Ed, for the presentation so far. So, you know, I think you kind of were starting to get into it with the last part of your presentation, but can you go in a little bit further? You know, we've worked on this redefining neglect and how that would change police working these cases. I mean, it sounds like that has been a lot of your problem. You've made a couple examples of that. And so it seems like that would take some off of your table as far as working some of these cases. Can you kind of expand into that a little bit more?
Well, I don't know if that will take any cases off our table. And if it does, our concern is it going to take cases off the table that shouldn't have been taken off our table? We shared this bill with all 3 of the associations I represent and asked for feedback on it. And I didn't count them, but I would estimate emails back from probably 25, 30 law enforcement officers across the state. Some of those came in groups where 4 or 5 of them in a larger agency would get together and send me that with their names on it. And every one of them was really concerned about the term, let me find it here, serious harm. I think where everybody struggles with that is where's that line between serious, and we have a definition out of Black's, although interestingly I couldn't find that in my little small Black's dictionary, but I'm sure it's in there somewhere. But it sounds like it's talking about an extremely serious risk to or serious type of injury. And so we struggle with what that means when we come across one of these cases and there's high risk or some level of risk to a child from the abuse, stick with neglect or the neglect cases. But does it rise to what would be called serious harm? Because there's no real fine line there on what's serious and what's not serious. And so then it becomes a question along with the may, then we may take them into custody other than not like today with shall. But when you put those 2 together, it's kind of a double whammy on where that line is for us. You know, may with the existing language is different than may with both things in there. And everybody voiced concern about that they thought children would be left in harm's way. Maybe not serious harm, but would be left subject to harm. So I think there's more discussion needs to be had on that. And if I remember right, I think when we met the other day, I think Mark Bennett brought that up as well, that there's concern with that phrase. Didn't get a lot of pushback on the other things, a little bit on the change to, in neglect to unreasonable failure or refusal. And one of the things that somebody asked me, a couple of them asked me actually, that I couldn't really give a good answer to, that maybe the reviser can enlighten us on, it's unreasonable failure or refusal. So does that mean unreasonable failure and unreasonable refusal, or does that mean unreasonable failure and just flat out refusal? So we don't know the answer to that. So that's an area that may need to be clarified so we understand for sure exactly what the legislative intent is with that.
So do you want to address that? I know what my intentions were. And it's unreasonable failure or refusal. I think if it was unreasonable failure and refusal, then it could apply to both, but not or.
Yeah. That's kind of the way I would interpret it, but I'm not an attorney, so I hesitated to do that.
Go ahead, Jesse.
If using unreasonable in front of, what was it, failure or refusal, I believe it could be interpreted to be applicable to both. And if you wanted it to be only one, then you could say refusal or unreasonable failure, and therefore the unreasonable is not applicable to the failure part. So that is something that could be clarified if that is, requested.
And if that is the legislative intent, I would suggest that because it raised questions.
I switched that. We did have that in the original. I switched that because I don't think refusal is it's not, I wanted to make sure that unreasonable failure was highlighted. But if we need to switch that back, that's fine. Representative Riley, did you have a follow-up?
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. So I think our intent was to make that so those marginal cases of neglect would be clearer to you that just because there's a dirty house or if somebody had a dirty diaper,
Right.
you're not going to take them into.
And I, just to be clear, nobody argued about the unreasonable word. I think it was rather it applied to both of those, or did it just apply to one? I think the unreasonable in there does clarify what I know the committee is trying to get at. Sometimes somebody can be in a situation they may be undernourished because of a failure to provide food, but it's not unreasonable in the condition that family is in at the time. I mean, that's a good example, and we would certainly take care of that. The other one that was brought up in conversations a lot was the lice issue, and I cannot even imagine, and I haven't found anybody in law enforcement that can imagine taking a child into custody for having lice,
It happened.
So, yeah.
You just haven't found them yet.
Yeah. So I think that's an outlier, but I think things like this help clarify that, the word unreasonable. The other one I want to mention, and I want to tell you because it was kind of my idea, it got in the bill, I think, about looking for other avenues to separate the child from the danger. And everybody liked that except for, I think, one person. They thought that was not only common practice, but they thought it was good to have it in statute so that it directed them that way, and also it kind of gave them that statutory authority to really do that especially when the word shall was in there before, that it made clear you have that option to do that and override the shall. And I did not direct them to that language. I sent the bill out and said, tell me what you think of these changes. I directed them to the sections of the bill that had amendments so they could find it in this long document. So that was met with some positive responses.
Good. Representative Page.
Madam Chair, I don't know if you know this or anybody ever thought about it, but what about DCF extending hours and having their own security system so they wouldn't have to necessarily call the police and then have staff. I don't know if anybody
we're-
does that.
Yeah, that is an idea that we are working on, so we'll see where that goes. It
So-
won't be this session.
So I think most of you know I was a chief of police for 5 years here in Topeka, and I was in police administration for about 14 years. And those things like that are easy to say we ought to do them, but they cost money and they cost staff time. And, if you have somebody even on callback, you have to pay them some amount of money, maybe not their full wage for all the hours they're on callback, but most of us will pay like 2 hours of salary if they're on call and don't receive a call. And if they get a call, they're paid a minimum of the 2 hours plus, if it goes over 2 hours their work, then they get paid for that. But that, overtime is time and a half, and overtime is not always budgeted in an agency like DCF. And so, it's not easy to design that, but I can say without hesitation that we would love, especially in neglect cases without any crime being involved, we would love to be able to have DCF come in with their expertise in handling these cases and their expertise with resources to handle those. It's easier for us to do in the more populated areas, but when you get out in rural Kansas, where an officer may run into one of these cases every 4 or 5 years, because what happens in rural America, when you have a child that is in need of care, usually the neighbors and the family's taking care of it. We don't even get involved. Neither does DCF. Yeah, the church, anybody. I mean, in those small communities, they take care of each other. And so it's kind of rare that they handle these. And with that comes an uncertainty when an officer is put into those situations. They don't handle them very often. And I'll cover some of the training stuff here a little bit in the slides.
Any other questions specifically about what he's asked or what he's presented so far, Representative Owsley?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Ed. In the police protective custody, what you're saying about a short stint when the parent's not there and you've got to get the child either back home or, reunited with the parent, that makes sense to me. I think part of the problem with that is also uniform reporting, from law enforcement agency to the DA's office to DCF. But in a situation where the child is removed for the 72 hours and then returns home without being adjudicated or assigned a sync case, do you know if DCF has contact with that family or that child, or is that child staying at JIAC for that 72 hours in situations?
I'm not sure I can answer that 100% accurate, just based on my knowledge of it. I know we are going to make every attempt, and so is the intake, to get hold of the parents. Now, I've worked cases with children where I couldn't get hold of the parents. And what happens after that, I'm not sure. We are supposed to report all those things to the district attorney and to DCF. That's in statute. And so it should be reported to both if we take a child into police protective custody, regardless of time. It should be reported.
Whether it's just a vehicle ride, across town to reunite, or, a longer period and intake, it still gets reported from the law enforcement agency.
I would hope the practice is, and it's the way I know it gets taught in a lot of places, that if you take a child into police protective custody, you must write a report on it, because you have to record the conditions that led you to believe that child was eligible for being taken into police protective custody, and report on what you found when you find the parents, if they're not there, and what the disposition of the child was.
Madam Chair. Okay, and then you mentioned, you'd been on a call for a barking dog. Run us through a scenario such like that, because I think that's part of what the intent of 2132 is trying to get at, and where there might be a situation in which no report's been called in or no concern's been, reported, yet a child is removed.
So again, regardless of how we come across that information, whether it's given to us by DCF, if it's given to us by a neighbor calling and we go investigate, or whether we just run across it in the course of a normal call, then if we take that child in police protective custody, there certainly should be a report generated. There's a requirement in statute that a written report has to be given to the district attorney without delay, so that they can do what they need to do to prepare for getting that child processed through the court if that becomes necessary. But I can tell you that in the meantime, there's a lot of things still going on to try to get hold of the parents and reunite with the parents if that's appropriate. That may not happen right away. It may happen the next day. Sometimes it's even, you know, dad is the problem. Mom lives in Oklahoma, and we're able to get a hold of mom the next day, and the mom comes up and takes custody of the child. And so those things play out. As to the type of call, you know, anytime we have contact with the inside of a house, which is on a lot of calls we go to, we're going to see things that may lead us to believe there's something wrong here. And when we do, we're going to investigate that. Now, sometimes, you know, good police work, you don't want 100% success. You know, sometimes we think something's wrong, but as we explore it more, there's nothing wrong. Or there's something very small wrong that is easily fixed without us taking any formal action. But the barking dogs call is just one. I say that because those happen in the night, and people invite us in their home at night when we're talking to them. So we get inside the home and we see things that, you know, raises concerns.
So the way the law is written now, it says the officer shall remove that child. So if we switch that shall to may, that would offer that officer some discretion.
Yeah, and I had some pushback from our people on that, but not consistent across the board. It was kind of a mix. And you know, this isn't something I had a conversation with people about, so I can't kind of quantify or qualify how they came to that conclusion. But I do think may gives us more discretion. But I think the concern, like I said earlier, is you do the may and you do the other change to serious harm, then now all of a sudden we're not them. But even shall and serious harm, you still got the serious harm. So that's telling us we can't do anything other than report it to DCF if there's lesser harm that may happen to the child. That's the concern.
Representative Riley?
Thank you again, Madam Chair. So, Ed, so what is the flexibility? And, you know, you've mentioned several times about taking a child, you know, out of the house, but I would imagine there's times when officers take 4 to 6 kids out of the house. So, you know, you have several kids that you're putting into custody. But on the other hand, what is typically the officer's flexibility or the judicial flexibility that if a police officer knows that family and knows an aunt or an uncle or a grandfather or whatever to take those children over there, is there some flexibility on there, or do they have to take them to juvie?
There is absolute flexibility, even with the current language. And that flexibility comes into where, if you look at 382232, I think it is, it tells us what we do when we take a child into custody. And even if we do it for a short term, right there on scene and then release them, that's still, you know, if we're not letting anybody near that child or the child leave, then we're doing that. So when 2132 first came out and we shared that with our members, I called some of them specifically and asked about some of these things. You know, what is the practice when we do this on finding other solutions? And I didn't have one person tell me that they didn't do that already. So the things we look for, one, what is the harm? And let me give you an example. We go in a house and there's illegal drugs laying on the table. Well, we're not going to leave them there. You know, we're not going to leave the drugs there. So is there a remaining risk to a child in that house at that situation? Now, there's going to be an absence of a parent probably, but, you know, it doesn't mean there's going to be an absence of every responsible person in the house either. So you look at things like, what was the drug? Is it fentanyl? And because fentanyl, if you've had it open in a house, that could be in the carpet. It can be where just a child crawling through the house get enough to be fatal. And so you kind of have to look at the grand scope of things, but get away from the drugs even. You know, we look for, is there a way to remove the harm from the child? And sometimes if it's a situation like a child is covered with feces or whether it's their own or the dog's and things like that, and we can reach out to a family member will come over and help clean up and take care of that child. Well, that's taking care of the problem without having to take it. Now, we're still going to report it, and I can't guarantee every officer is going to do that, but we find that's the general practice that we're told takes place.
Representative Humphreys?
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I'm just a little unclear on sort of some of the procedures. So if you just stick with me. Okay, the barking dog or the dog, whatever. If it's during the day, like, so it's not at night, it's during the day, you go, but you find something that is concerning for truly the welfare of the child. Do you call DCF at that point for them to come remove, or you take that child in police protective custody at that point?
Good question. And the answer is maybe. Which doesn't help a lot, right? But you're going to find in larger jurisdictions, and we'll talk about some data here in a minute, and there are places where they have that relationship with DCF where they can get hold of them anytime, even in the day. But you'll see in some of the data we receive back that even during the daytime we have trouble getting hold of DCF in some jurisdictions. And so as a general rule, you know, we kind of respond to what our experience is. And if we can hardly ever get a response from DCF, we're probably just going to notify them and go ahead and take some kind of action. And then hopefully DCF can meet us at intake or whatever and start doing their work. You get out in the rural areas, there may not be a DCF worker even close. It may be hours before they can get there if they leave right now. So
Madam Chair, if a DCF worker is available, would you just wait for them to get there? I mean, I'm just trying to picture, what is this like? Like, did they come and what happens if there is someone?
I think it's extremely rare that happens, and it's because of the time lag of getting the DCF worker there.
So
now keep in mind that sometimes we get a call from DCF and we're both there together. It doesn't happen a lot, but sometimes that happens and we're both there. And then we just support DCF in making those decisions.
Okay, and so so you're there together. Does that child get put in the car with the caseworker or with the police officer?
Well, when there's no caseworker, I can tell you with certainty it's going to be in a police car.
Yeah, but if you were both
there. But if they're both there, I would hope we would use the caseworker. But I couldn't tell you that always happens. I don't know.
So then what my question is if DCF, let's say, you know, somehow we are able to work it out where DCF was available 24/7. But it seems like even if you were able to call them 24/7, how are they going to help? Like, are they going to come? Are they going to make the decision? Are they just going to talk to the police officer through the situation? Or how is that going to help?
So I try to be a realist on these things and realizing that the chances of us getting that kind of a quick response from DCF in the current, you know, fiscal state and everything else is probably about as small as Capers employees getting, or retirees getting a COLA. So, you know, I am a realist. And so my thought was, you know, let's take baby steps on this. Let's just be able to talk to a caseworker or an investigator from DCF, that we can describe what we're seeing and we can talk about options and things like that. I think that's the easiest first step to do. We would be a long ways off from DCF to have the capacity to do that. I don't work in DCF, but I would imagine they have the same capacity problems we do they probably have struggles handling the caseload they have.
Can I interrupt for just
Thank
one
you.
second? Jessie is leaving. She has to get to another committee, but I wanted to thank her for all of her hard work this session. Thank you, Jessie. Have fun. Okay, sorry, go ahead.
So I think you've hit, though, Representative Humphries, on one of the issues around this is how these get handled varies widely depending on what the resources are. I mean, you go into Sedgwick County and they've got very good 24/7 coverage from their law enforcement joint task force that works on these. And they have DCF employee embedded in it. And so those kind of connections are happening just as a matter of routine. You go into the Kansas City area in Johnson County and probably Shawnee County and some of the other more populated counties, I think you'll find that there's strong relationships between law enforcement and the local caseworkers, that the caseworker answers the phone at 8 o'clock at night or 2 in the morning when we really need their help. And those are usually just phone calls, I think. But you get out in other areas and you don't have a chance to build those relationships because you're not working on a frequent basis as you are in those populated areas.
Could I just ask one? So do you have any idea, I mean, I know this is kind of a wild question, but in any given night, evening, not, 7 p.m. to 7 a.m., how many children in the state are taken into police protective custody?
I have no idea. I mean, you've got numbers from DCF. You could divide that by the number of days in a year and say on the average it'd be this many per year.
I asked this because if there's a DCF hotline, a person where the police can call to get, even in the rural areas, can they get a caseworker to talk them through what the situation looks like? I don't know, but I don't know how many calls does that mean they're getting, but, okay.
I don't think we have that data. At least I haven't seen that data. I know law enforcement doesn't have that data collected statewide. I don't even know if we have that in our local databases.
Right.
Broken down to that point, we could get it.
Yep, okay, well.
But I'll say this, like a city the size of Topeka, it doesn't happen even every week, but it happens with regularity.
Okay, well, that's helpful, yeah. Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
I know 2 weeks ago, or a week and a half ago, I guess, Friday night, 13 children were taken in Sedgwick County alone, so.
That was one night.
One night. 13. On a Friday night, yeah. Representative Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. In answer to the one question, whether the police take the child or a caseworker, in any case I've ever been involved with for DCF, it was always the social worker or myself as a special investigator, not the police. We had the equipment if we were there. The problem is we all went home at 5 o'clock, and so we weren't there. The second comment is it varies from region to region, not just big, medium, small, but because many of our smaller towns simply have one officer, 2 officers on duty, there's 2 deputies out for the whole county. They don't have the time to deal with these situations. And even the large departments, I'll just say Wyandotte County with the police department, if they're having a busy night, they're not going to have enough officers to stay and take care of the kids. And that creates a real issue. And we're still short. I know in Johnson County, and I'll speak on behalf of Lenexa, there are nights they're making so many calls, when they get one of these, it takes 2 or 3 officers or 2 officers and a supervisor to deal with it. And to handle 2 or 3 or multiple children at one time is deadly. I mean,
And here's some information to demonstrate the magnitude of that issue. 430 law enforcement officers in the state of Kansas. That's state agencies and local school districts that have law enforcement, the whole gamut. Half of those, about half of them, have 5 or fewer officers. 70% of them have 10 or fewer officers. To staff one officer on the street in a small town like that, 24/7, takes a minimum of 5 officers. Takes 5 officers to staff at one position 24/7. So in half of our agencies, that's exactly the situation. They probably aren't even on duty 24/7. They probably get called out in the middle of the night when the call comes in. And then it kind of goes up from there.
I'm going to move on. Can we move to your survey?
You can.
Because I think that is great.
Okay.
While we're moving to the survey, Representative Owsley, one last question.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And this is segue into it. So I think you just answered my question because I'm looking ahead to the survey. And question 2, what size is your agency? 29.11% answered 50 or more officers.
Right.
So is that reflective of the size of departments? You know, do we have 30% or more across the state with 50 or more officers?
No, that percentage is going to be pretty small. I don't know what it is off the top of my head, but it wouldn't be big. Probably less than 10%, I'd say. I think what those numbers, and if you go to what's down at the bottom of the page, 2/11, that's the page I think you're talking about. And so I think the reason that is a larger number than representative of just the spread of agency size is that larger agencies deal with this more frequently. And so more people are willing to give their feedback to these surveys because it's not something they just handled 2 years ago. That's something they handle on a fairly regular basis. So they respond more to these than the small agencies do.
Thank you.
So going to the survey, the page that has the /11, that survey was made of field investigations. So these were officers who are answering calls and their experience with getting into these situations and doing whatever activity is we're surveying on. So I put the rank there because I wanted to get a spread of how many were uniformed officers and how many were investigators. And you see the investigators are very small. And you see supervisors are pretty large because these cases generally you end up getting a supervisor to help you make those decisions. And then we've already talked about the agency size. If you go over to page 3 of that set, we ask, have you experienced an issue with any of these things while conducting a child welfare field investigation? And child welfare is understood to be both neglect and abuse. And you look at these numbers and it reflects what we've seen before, and it's not a fault of DCF. It's a matter of capacity and availability of DCF in most of these cases. But you'll see that even that third, the second one, the blue bar, dark blue bar, second from the top, that's contacted a caseworker outside of DCF hours, and the top one, the green, is inside DCF hours. So we have that difficulty even during their business hours to get hold of a DCF worker. And again, that's not to fault them. I mean, we're all busy doing investigations, but it's just the fact of that's our experience. The yellow bar is contacting the call center. And so over 40% of the time we have trouble getting hold of somebody there. And then that light blue one is contacting the DCF contractor. Because a lot of times, especially when we're dealing with a foster child that is in a DCF contractor's control, we know who that is and we'll call them direct and try to get a response. So that, again, that's just our experience on the difficulty we have in getting hold of them. And then on page 4, it talks about in the past year, I try to limit these in time so we don't get people thinking back 6 years ago. In the past year, how many times have you called or attempted to call the call center? And those are just the number of times they called for that particular officer that's responding. So you'll see that about a third of them had attempted to make that contact more than, or 5 or more times. And then on page 5, again, we're asking their experience when you call the center, whether the information you got was let's see, yeah, we're asking there, did they call? And so a vast, over a third of them said they had not tried to call. The dark blue is they called and talked to a person every time they called. And then the yellow was able to talk to a person in some calls, not the others, and so on. So, and keep in mind that when we call the call center, like to report an incident that we're investigating, that isn't always done by calling the call center. They have an electronic program that we can enter that in as well. And you talk to the people that do this a lot, and they like using the electronic program, although they tell us it's clunky. But they like using the electronic, so they never try to call the DCF on the phone. And then those that don't do it very often don't know where that's at, or just it's easier to call them on the phone and tell them, what you've got, and let them record it. Then on page 6, we're talking again about child abuse and neglect both. And again, we're saying to call the DCF center to request information in response to a child abuse or neglect that you initiated or investigated in response to call for service. And so we just have the data from that. And I'm a little alarmed about that, nearly 60% having not called the DCF call center, because we are mandatory reporters. But hopefully we're getting that information DCF as we're required to.
So would there be any confusion in that with the electronic versus the call center? With the
There
people
could be,
completing the
yes, it
survey?
could be.
Okay.
Because it's asked specifically called the call center. I didn't inquire on the electronic stuff. And this isn't, nor is this isolated to just the calls of the mandatory reporting stuff either. It could be any call for any reason. And then the question 7, that has to do with if you were able to speak to somebody at the call center to assist in a field investigation, how helpful was the assistance you received? So this survey did that on a scale of 1 to 5. So when you see the 46 there, it's not 46%. It means on the average, the answer was 4.6 out of 5. So they were satisfied with the responses they got and the assistance they got once they got a hold of somebody. And then on question 8, we dealt with the ability to speak with DCF caseworker or investigator after regular business hours when faced with a decision to remove a child from the home help you in making the decision in abuse cases. This is strictly on abuse cases. And it was over 80% said yes, that would be helpful to us. And I asked that for a specific reason, because we were, had been talking over the interim in the joint committee about this issue of how do we get, more input from DCF. And then the next page is the same question talking about neglect cases. And it's a little bit lower, but it's still over 80% said yes, that would be helpful. And that's why I've emphasized so much how helpful that would be if we can just talk to a caseworker. We don't have to have them on the scene all the time, but just to talk with them and go over what we have and what's the resources DCF knows about that we don't.
It is interesting on those 2 questions, the no didn't change. Just the yes and the not
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
And I would imagine the no's on those two questions are primarily from people that do this on a regular basis, and they're confident in their decision-making, and they have the experience to know what they should and shouldn't do. Question 10 is talking about the training they had. I was really happy to see that nobody reported they had no training because they get training in basic school. But I was intrigued that such a big percent of them, almost half, I guess it's just over half, indicated they were getting adequate training, but they desired to have more. So that tells you that our officers are wanting to do better on this, and they're wanting to learn more. So I think we're going to be working on some things like that with DCF. We've already got some things in the works, but frankly, I haven't had time with the session going on to give that the attention that I think DCF would like to have from me on it. So then we move into the second survey, and this is talking to investigators. And it's kind of the same thing. You'll see the rank and position chart. Next one is the size of the agency. And then in this case, what you have to remember is when you get into the smaller agencies, I'd say generally 20 to 25 officers or less, they may not have a person who is truly solely an investigator of anything. Oftentimes, they're doing street duty and investigations at the same time. So I think that's why you see a shift in those numbers. Again, we ask what they experienced an issue with in conducting child welfare investigations, and same pretty much basic, I think, span of responses in that as the other one. And then question 4 is the experience and issues with conducting child welfare investigation. Here we ask about, and this was more important on the investigator side, completeness of information provided. I want to take some time on this because if you just look at this, it doesn't look very good. But you remember 2 years ago, we changed the law to clarify the exchange of information between DCF and law enforcement. One of the problems was redaction of reports. These bars were way high back then. And what this shows is there has been a positive change from the result of those changes you all made in the statute 2 years ago. We're still not where we'd like to be. And you'll notice that on the, let's see which one it is. Maybe on a different chart. There's one here that shows the redactions. So go to 5. Yeah, here it is. Check all the below that you have experienced an issue with while conducting child welfare investigation. Kind of the second round, same question. And you go down to one of these, I think is the one that has redactions in it. I don't see it in that one either. It's in one of these. Okay, it's on 6.
It's on page 6.
I do want to point out in this one, one of the things that I've commonly heard from investigators is unrecorded interviews of the victim conducted by DCF. I am not that familiar with that process, so I don't know exactly what they're asking about, but I would imagine that DCF knows. So there's still not the fluid communications going on that I think we all expect, but I will say this, it's getting better. I've had conversation with DCF. I know they're working on this and trying to improve this, and I think we've seen some things over the survey we did a couple of years ago. So yes, go to 6 and you'll see the redacted is the yellow bar there, still receiving 47% of the reports they receive have redactions in them yet. And I thought that was not supposed to happen after we did those law changes, but it still is apparently. Again, the training question was asked, same thing as what was shown in the other, the high bar on adequate, but I need more. Nobody said they didn't get any training. And on 8, I asked this question because of things where I was being told by investigators across the state. And was there a need for a mechanism for an investigator, prosecutor, DCF employee, or DCF contractor to request an after-case review beyond a local multidisciplinary team? In other words, not the multidisciplinary team, but when we run into difficulty in one of these areas, redacted report or something like that, should any of us be able to say, can we get a Zoom meeting or something, and let's talk through this, and why did this happen, and how do we fix it? And the response was 67%, 2/3 said yes, that would be helpful. And I don't think those have to be face-to-face meetings either. Then on 9, I asked if there was a need for a third-party review of interpretation of statutes. I kind of asked that because that was the core problem, and I carried that question over from the one I did a couple of years ago. And the reason I asked that question back then, because one of the issues we thought was going on was a matter of how statutes were being interpreted differently by law enforcement and DCF. And so if we have that difference in interpretation, where do we go to get that resolved? And so that's why that question was in there. And then I asked in question 10, did amending the statute clarify? And you'll see that 50-some% said some improvement, 22% notable improvement, and 7 said now they're getting everything they needed. That is a significant improvement. DCF did a wonderful job once that statute was passed in trying to address that. They were actually working on it before the statute was passed. And so I want to thank them for that. Number 11, I ask of the investigators, would the ability to talk to DCF caseworker be advantageous in abuse and neglect cases? And you see the results there, 81% said yes. And then the same question during business hours, 76% said yes. And then I ask if they have a caseworker assigned to them, and you'll see there that 35% of them said they actually have a caseworker assigned that works with their agency. So that was higher than I expected it to be, just from general feedback I was getting. So I was real pleased to see that. And I would imagine that blue bar is mostly your rural areas where you have those small agencies and not a lot of DCF coverage. So that's the results of the survey I took. And again, I don't want to sound negative towards DCF because they have been working diligently to try to address these problems. But like the rest of us, they're not short on activity, but they're short on resources, personnel, and things like that. And these cases aren't easily resolved in a lot of cases. They take a significant amount of manpower. And now to stand for questions.
Okay, thank you very much. Questions, committee? Silence. Okay, I have a couple questions. At the end of each of these surveys, you had where any additional suggestions or comments, there was 17 on the first one and 22 that answered. What were some of those?
And bring those with me, and I don't know them off the top of my head. I'm always hesitant to include those in these type of reports because I often find that they respond to these surveys communicating with me or the association, and I like to say they need sanitized a little bit sometimes.
Okay. I was just curious if there were anything.
I will go through those, and I'd be glad maybe on the 31st I could pull some of those out and kind of pull out some highlights of some of the topics that they were talking about, because some of them were, consistent throughout where they talk about the same issues. I'll do a little study on that and try to pull something together for that meeting.
There may be something else we need to address. I was just curious because sometimes those comments can open a whole door that we need to look at.
When I look at this, I don't see anything that stands out to me that we're not already talking about now. How do we get better access to DCF from law enforcement? I'm sure DCF could tell me some stories about law enforcement too that I would love to be able to include in some training, because it does work both ways, and it has to work both ways for the sake of the child. And when it doesn't work both ways, no matter who's at fault or where the shortfall is, I hate to use the word fault, but where the shortfall is, it's affecting the child. It's affecting the outcome of the case. It could result in us not getting the case right. It could result in not addressing a real issue that's occurring that, and it leads to duplication of services, duplication of inquiries. I know a lot of investigators tell me what they hate is have DCF do an interview, and then you go in and you do an interview from law enforcement with the same family members, same child, and it's just that much more trauma on the family and the child. And we don't do that in a lot of cases. In abuse cases, we have a system in place where we're able to do those interviews collectively and organized.
Representative Roser, you had a question?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. Speaking of duplication, do you receive the initial mental health and trauma screen that is done on the child?
I don't know for sure. I'd have to check to see.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Okay, well, I really appreciate you being here. I think one of the important takeaways for me was data. For one, we're not tracking the data from the police protective custody as detailed as we probably need it to be, just to be able to make evaluations from. And then two, just sharing the data. And I don't know how that would work, but it's something we need to explore for sure. Getting the information to the police so they can make decisions, so they know the whole story when they're there.
Right.
Is very important.
So we're pretty good at tracking crime data. The problem with a neglect case especially is there's no crime in a lot of these cases. So, we don't have a classification for that necessarily, at least it's not a standard one, because the state crime data system collects crime data. It doesn't collect non-crime data.
And then you'll know when they've been called 96 times to the same house like we had in Sedgwick County.
Yeah.
That's important data to know.
And that's a good point. And, we know when we were getting repeat calls to the same house. We know that within our own agency, but sharing that information can become challenging. And then you have to sort through it, how many are related to what I'm looking at today. And the same with DCF. It's helpful if DCF, and we talked about this 2 years ago when we was working on the statute, it's helpful if DCF has everything we have on that child and that family. It's helpful if we have everything DCF has on that child and that family, including cases that didn't get assigned for investigation, because sometimes that all reflects a pattern that helps us get to the right answer.
Okay, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you.
I really appreciate it. We'll see you on the 31st for sure, the joint committee. Okay, committee, any ideas we should explore next session? Anything that stood out to you? Final comments for this session. Representative Humphreys.
Well,
Before you do that,
Yes.
Judy, could you be sure to take detailed notes for me as well on these suggestions? Yeah, thank you.
Yep. So not a surprise to anybody. I want to just continue to explore how attachment is taken into consideration when we're making decisions on placement for permanency. And then the other thing I want to look at, which is similar, is an appeal process after a best interest staffing decision, or after a decision. I don't know when exactly the appeal would happen, but there are many other states that do have an appeal process for after the permanency decision is made, and there is some sort of process for that. So those two things, I'm going to stay with it till we come up with a solution. Thank you.
Thank you. And I don't know if this is the same. I've talked to DCF about, there is an appeal process now. Is that on permanency, Tanya, do you know? And yeah, so the problem that I've found with this and we need to address is that whoever the contractor is, the appeal process is through other people in that contractor. And so therefore it is not, even if it is fair, it has the appearance of being biased. And so we want to look at that. Okay,
Okay, and I'll just say what we've worked on before is an actual legal appeal process.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah, so that would be not just internal, but in the court system. Yeah, thank you.
Perfect. Representative Roser.
Is it any topic for child welfare?
Yes.
Okay. initial mental health and trauma screens, so IMHTS, and how that's related to what they do inside of the school building and how it relates to IEPs. I have a whole email, I can read it, but that seems like a lot. The definition of kinship care and the qualifications for receiving services under kinship care, because if we change the definition, it's going to change some of those qualifications. You'll have to come back to me because I'm blanking on the rest of them.
Okay, great. Other, Representative Page.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I know the gentleman said cost is a factor, but if there's some way that if someone is working for DCF, if they had a night crew and a day crew, they all get paid the same. Some people would prefer to come in at night. And if that was something they could work out and make it feasible where it wouldn't cost so much, and they may want to do the night. Their wife might work a shift or whatever's happening in their own home. Some people would prefer to do night than day. And if that's a way to work it out, why not look and see if other people are doing it?
That's great. And Representative Owsley is already on that 24/7 response. So, but that is a very good point. I appreciate that. Because people need different schedules. Not everybody's 9 to 5, right? Okay. Other ideas, Representative Johnson.
This is not a new idea. I just want to say thank you to this whole committee because I've been on it 5 years now, and I'm just seeing very positive results in different things. So this weekend, I got somebody sending me a message of some sort. We've saved another child through the Safe Haven. That's 4. Who would have thought when we started on this with the Joint Committee? So if you're new to the committee, some of the things that you do and the bills that you're working on, your ideas, you're going to see one day they're going to say, wow, you guys made a difference. And that's why this is such an important committee. Thank you.
Representative Pickert.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think we need to take a look at ways that communities can embrace families, whether it be families that are fostering, families that are in jeopardy, and have the potential of losing their child to foster care, families that just need some help. But how can we get like churches and organizations and just people out there to do something? There are efforts now that are starting up, but we need to, I think we all need to know what's going on and use our influence to help grow that.
Good. Other ideas, Representative Roser?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Is there a way that we could look at what qualifies as sibling, I don't want to use the word reunification, but keeping siblings together in the system? My sister and I stayed in the system together, but we didn't start off that way. And so I want to look into how Kansas processes that, especially when you've got an older child in the home who could technically contribute to the household. Do they, what qualifies them to be pulled out of the home versus the younger ones? Since I came from a situation where the older got to stay until it got worse, and then she was also taken, and then I got pulled from my foster family to be together with her, but then we got separated. So just looking at how we keep siblings together and how we're going to define and qualify that just because of half siblings or siblings who were in a foster home together. Maybe they're not even blood related, but looking at that. And then,
Are you talking about like while they're in care? Or are you talking about after adoption, if they got adopted by different families?
both.
Right. Okay.
The other thing is, it's going to be controversial, looking at the caseload for foster care employees and how we can best support them. And then the last thing is putting Executive Order 2501 into statute, how we would be able to do that in a fiscally responsible way while still upholding the executive order.
That was when we heard first committee on where we would no longer be taking Social Security and military benefits from children.
It's the accounts for the kids and yep.
Okay. Anything else, committee? These are all good ideas. I like where we're heading. I don't know if we'll take them all up. We have a very limited amount of time, but I will definitely try to prioritize them. If you think of them over the summer, then email them to me. Okay, let's get that connection going. And yes, go ahead, Representative Humphries.
I'm sorry, I just thought of one other bigger one that, the Judicial Council does have a committee on the guardian ad litem. Okay. And so I don't know, I think we're hoping to finish up our, let's see, Carrie, finish up our work before next session. And if so, there might be a bill that they would put forward or either a suggestion. So we might be working on guardian ad litem stuff.
That would be great because we've waited a long time for that.
Yeah.
That would be a very good discussion. And just for the committee, I think the Judicial Council is looking at whether guardian ad litem should be looking at the best interest of the child or they should be representing the child's interest. Those are two different things. Is that correct? Kind of. Sort of. You can expand on it. You're on the council.
So a guardian ad litem, by definition, represents the best interest of the child. But would we also provide an attorney for the child? And then there's a whole discussion of training of guardian ad litems and maybe having a central committee for guardian. I mean, there's all kinds of ideas being thrown out. And so far, there's not a consensus, but certainly working on, because in some districts, the guardian ad litems are very helpful and involved, and others not so much. So how do we keep that high standard of guardian ad litems?
Great, thank you. Okay, anything last minute? Okay, well, we've done a lot of good work this year. We've had a lot of hard conversations. I really, really appreciate that. 2132 is not dead. It is sitting below the line. I stand behind the work this committee did. I am going to be having conversations over the summer. It was interesting. I read one sheriff's email, and he believes that we are lowering the standard for removal. So there seems to be some real confusion as what we're doing. So I'm going to be talking this summer and fall with sheriffs and district attorneys. District Attorney Bennett and Ed Klump they've both agreed to continue these conversations. And that bill, if we still stand behind it and nothing changes, we'll be ready to work first week of session. So I am excited about that. I do want to thank our staff for Jesse already thanked, for Natalie, and oh my goodness, my mind just went blank. Jacob, oh my goodness. I want to call you Brian. I was like, that's not right. That is not Brian. Okay, that's Jacob. I should know that my son-in-law is Jacob. And then Judy here, who did all the testimony and everything. Just thank you very much. We can give them a round of applause. We have a great staff. I really appreciate their help. And then also Vice Chair Johnson for bringing us cookies today and all of his support this session. And then my ranking Democrat who has a wealth of information and knowledge because he's been on here for a long time, and I do appreciate that. And then all of you, great discussions this year. We'll carry on next year. And we'll see you later. Thank you. We are adjourned.